today we are joined by Adolph Reed, author of The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. I think it's interesting that throughout the book there are these anecdotes that seem kind of baldly as relics of Jim Crow. But the dominant narrative these days is like nothing has changed.
Right.
There's this enduring form.
Right.
What are the stakes for you in making it very, very clear what has changed and what has not changed?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, like as a scholar, right, I'm just committed to getting the story straight, right? So that's one thing. And I just said to somebody a few days ago that whenever I hear the "nothing has changed" line, my impulse is that I wish I could I wish I had a Wayback Machine and could take the utterer and drop him or her in the Mississippi Delta in 1950 for about 6 weeks, then come back and pick them up. So that's part of it. And part of the problem is that assertion just betrays the extent to which people don't pay attention to the substance of the history, but get captured by the freeze-frame photos. Right? I mean, speaking of Ava DuVernay's Selma. But the most important thing, right, right beyond my pedantry, basically, is that we can't get a handle on what current black politics is, or current race and politics, or the nexus of race and politics are, without understanding what undergirded that history, what was discrete about it, right? What forces, political, economic forces, brought it into existence, why, and therefore where Jim Crow fits in an account of the evolution of American capitalism, right, over the last 300 years.
So where do you think it fits? Because there have been these attempts to kind of rework the story of the birth of America to be slavery. It's the original sin, the origin of every issue, past, present, future. Yes. To me, I saw parallels between that narrative and the Republican narrative of white supremacy, which also imagines an enduring white race that's existed forever. But aside from fighting it on that end, what are the particularities we need to pull out about how Jim Crow shaped the America that we're in today, and how we actually do combat racism and economic injustice? Okay.
Well, see, I'm not sure that our fight is with something called racism in the first place, right? I mean, I think, and that's another front on which I think we've lost badly over the last 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, will you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I've said this in like some places before, but a couple of years before I retired, I taught a grad seminar in Black American political thought, and it was really more of a bibliography course than it was anything else. The readings were massive, and students, led the discussions every week. And one week, a first-year student, and this was in, I think, fall semester, so it was like a first semester grad student who was a political theory type, was leading discussion around a massive readings between the mid-30s and the mid-40s. And it's like stuff from Ralph Bunche and Oliver C. Cox and a bunch of other people. And she began her comments by saying the thing that really surprised her was that nobody talked about the need to combat racism. Right? They were all fighting for concrete stuff and against concrete stuff. They were debating about specific visions of social organization. And they knew there was racism out there, right? But racism wasn't the enemy, it was institutions. And when you think about the struggle against racism, it's like first cousin to anti-terrorism, right? Because it's nothing concrete, like it doesn't live any place, right? There's no state that it's connected to. And the beauty of it is that you can never defeat it permanently. So like, if you're a racial justice warrior, then you basically got a job for life, right? And that's the thing I don't like about how we have come to talk about racism as the source of empirically observable inequalities, and this has been a problem for people who want to do that too, and that's why they've concocted modifiers, right, to support a claim that it's not, that there's something more to racism than an attitude or a disposition. So it's institutional, which has its own history and kind of a concrete programmatic history, but stuff like structural racism or systemic racism, and from the way that people talk about it, that there's nothing there except the way that it makes them feel to say it.
Yeah.
Right.
Attaching systemic seems
right.
really legit.
Oh, yeah. Right. Keeping it real. Right.
Yeah, but they couldn't define what systemic racism is.
No.
I think it's interesting in light of, the content of your book, which is literally saying this is what segregation looked like on the ground.
Right.
And that in each instance of segregation, there were ambiguities. Can you give an example from the book where you included it to illustrate that kind of concept?
Yeah, I think the neighborhood stuff kind of does that too, right? Fairly early, right? I mean, so like and like this, I like this one too because it's another one that helps to show how stupid I was about some stuff for so long. So in older southern cities, and it's not just New Orleans, but it's like this in Charleston, a bunch of other places too. Residential segregation wasn't a thing until the 20th century, right?
Yeah. You have a line that neighborhoods were invented to kind of support a concept of the way that we ought to be living together and who we ought to be living with.
Correct, right, right, absolutely. And it's not quite the same, well, it kind of was the same in the North and the Midwest where suburbanization happened earlier. Like in Chicago, for instance, like the big flood to the suburbs came with improvement of streetcar technology, but also with the Haymarket riot, which just sort of drove the bourgeoisie up the lake because they were afraid the workers were going to kill them and drink their eyeball fluid. But when planned development came to the South, Baltimore on down, like it came at a historically specific moment when the urban planning was becoming a thing, when the idea of planned living, right, was what was beginning to get progress or appeal from capital P progressives, but also at the height or crest, at least, of anti-immigrant anxiety, and especially in the South after defeat of the populist insurgency, where upper status people felt like a cultural need on a daily basis to reassert their primacy in the social order, and to distance themselves from presumed social inferiors, right? And linthead is as much a racial category as coon, basically. So it's in this period that you begin to see these class and race homogeneous communities being planned, right? And it's not because, and I've learned that this is another distinction that a lot of people have some difficulty taking in. But it's because my argument isn't that people didn't think about racial hierarchy. No, it's that people didn't think about where you live as a domain for expressing your place within the racial hierarchy, right? And that took the emergence of the real estate industry and the idea of the neighborhood. Now, what made me feel especially stupid about this was that this didn't crystallize in my head until I started teaching Thomas Hanchett's book on Charlotte, North Carolina from 1900 to 1975. And Hanchett lays out how it happened in Charlotte. And then all of a sudden it hit me, like you can think about the dates of the neighborhoods, right? That had the reputation for being white, and it's like mainly after World War I. I mean, so people find themselves in these neighborhoods, And there's a natural disposition to be casually or convivial right at the quotidian level, right? Talking over the fence or whatever. And the way that, and I write about this, I mean, how people, whites from the neighborhood who were friendly, within the boundaries that everybody accepted, right? Who, when you would encounter them someplace outside the neighborhood and experience a snub most often, and like this is and understanding that I grew into, like a kid wouldn't appreciate this anyway. And by kid I mean through teenage or through the high period of the civil rights movement, frankly. That like they were trying to navigate this thing too, right? And I mean, people tend not to think that the order was imposed on people. Right?
Yeah, they think it was born of their own feelings, and so it was natural, like a fish in water.
Right.
But actually, everybody, and your book shows this really acutely, everybody had to kind of negotiate against it constantly.
Right.
Like you have the story of the white couple that owned a shop who kind of sat you down after you stole a bag of potato chips.
Right.
I hope you've stopped that, by the way.
Oh yeah, I did. And look, all I could think about was Angola.
Yeah, I mean, there is something also important, I think, to unpack there, which is that in this reworking of American history around contemporary liberal narratives about race, there are other fictions that emerge around prison, incarceration, segregation of neighborhoods, all of these things. For you, when you were in that moment as a kid, you did something every kid does, tried to steal a snack.
Right.
But the full weight of the realization that actually there was a system in which you did not have complete citizenship, would not be completely respected, and didn't have the rights of others. That hit you in that moment, stealing a bag of chips.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but like I took the bus home from school, like in a lot of different routes. And on one of them, riding on the Tulane bus down to Tulane Avenue, you go right past the courthouse at Broad and Tulane, and the parish prison is right next to it. And emblazoned on the front of the courthouse is, "The impartial administration of justice is the foundation of liberty." And every time I rode past that, I just wanted to kill somebody.
Yeah.
Right, because hypocrisy, God, right, my God. But and so the other thing about this sensibility that like whites just kind of Jim Crow just kind of came out of the white psyche or whatever. Also, when I was a kid, my dad said this very often. I can't count the times I can remember him saying it. But the orthodoxy in the 50s in particular was that Jim Crow and lynching and stuff were the product of the backward, racist, white working class, which was empowered right after the populist movement. And my father would always say, often enough, with a bottle of a Miller High Life in his hand, "Gee, isn't it? But it's really weird, isn't it? I mean, didn't you think that if the white working class came to power, that they'd want to get something for themselves, or that they want to get something besides just being nasty to black people, right?" So I grew up with that understanding too. But
you talk about these anecdotes from when Jim Crow is kind of breaking down, and there's this place between the transition of one system to another, where the ambiguity makes the tension seem more acute.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think that made a kind of, I don't know, do you think that made some parts of the white population in the South cling to or become more committed to the ideology of segregation as it started to fade away? Well,
yeah, in one sense it did, right? Because of fading away what was over a couple of decades. and the intense violence against civil rights workers.
Yeah.
Right, is one illustration of that. The case of that old guy, like in Fayetteville, North Carolina, was
shoulder checked you.
Right. Yeah, I'm not embarrassed about my reaction. Right. I'm not proud of it. Right. If he had continued and I'd beaten him down like in the alcove, I still wouldn't have been embarrassed by it. Right. Because I felt then, and I feel now in retrospect, that if he missed it that much, then he must have been a guy who really deserved the ass kicking that he never got.
Imagine what he did when it was fully sanctioned and expected. Right.
And frankly, it took me a long time to kind of get away from that attitude. Right? Frankly, it may have it may have taken leaving the region, but and getting older. But so there's that, right? I mean, people clung to it, and at the same time, I mean, I recall my dad talking about this too. It's that the three racists whom the Archbishop excommunicated in 1962. My dad, who was an atheist, just kept saying, "Well, look, like the church has been telling," and the Gallo woman was the big villain. But he said, "Yeah, like the church has been telling her like all her life that segregation was God's law or whatever, and now they're telling her it's not." And I mean,
how's she supposed to react to that?
Yeah, right. And then people would do stuff like, for instance, when you sat down next to somebody on the bus, even years after, often enough a white person would jump up, right? And what I always found kind of funny was like, because you really do need a program to figure out who's supposed to be what down there. A couple times I sat down with somebody I just assumed was safe, because I'm not looking to draw. Look, as a teenager, the last thing you want to do is draw attention to yourself in public, right? Yep. And somebody who I assumed to be close enough to black for it not to be an issue would pop up. So there were things like that, right? Yeah. That persisted.
Where the system leaves and it's structured interactions in a certain way, and then in the absence of it, people really don't know where they fall.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Right.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.